So I think it's over to me to welcome everybody this afternoon. That's right. You're happy for me to do it?
Yeah.
Welcome. Yes. It's not really my conference, but I'm happy to be a ceremonial start. And I'm going to give all the credit immediately to Pascoe, who's done the work behind the vision and getting everyone in the room. And who'll do a bit more of explaining about what we're doing and why, I think, after me. But this is a very special day. And I think an important event for the faculty. Unlike other law schools, we have for some time and continue to be a powerhouse of empirical legal scholarship, which is something we're extremely proud of, and something that we are very, very committed to retaining. It requires real commitment to retain that, because there are all sorts of things that go into empirical legal scholarship that I know you'll talk about today, but lots of thinking, money, time, and that's something that's not always the easiest to carve out in a busy law school. And so it is a genuinely a big commitment, and one that the faculty as a whole is committed to. I think what I find really remarkable about the work of all of the empirical legal scholars in the faculty is, one, its diversity. It's kind of true to the bigger spirit of the faculty and of good knowledge production, of coming at thinking about law and building knowledge from a range of perspectives and methodologies. It's not one kind of way of thinking. And that builds incredible richness into the research and thinking about law and legal systems. There's also a really remarkable link to access to justice and the legal profession in much of our empirical legal work, which I think it lends itself to that kind of those kinds of issues, but also is part of the strength of the faculty. And I think particularly on the access to justice front, that's really part of our kind of value system as a faculty as well. But there's too many of the faculty members to mention them all, but the breadth of the work from kind of the paths to justice stuff that's really underpinned CAJ and all of its fantastic work, Pascoe's kind of ongoing work on legal needs globally, keep informing sustainable development goals and various things I can't keep up with, but it's always very impressive. The work of the Judicial Institute and Cheryl on judges and juries, Karen's post office work, which she's been very good at keeping out of the media. She's got a defense. The research is ongoing, which I think is fantastic. And I know many more of you doing incredible work. But beyond the empirical legal scholars in the faculty, there is such an increasing appetite for doing and engaging with this kind of work across the faculty. And we got that sense, I think, a couple of years ago at an Education Away Day. Lots of people want to do and engage with empirical legal scholarship. And I think that's a service that we in the faculty really want to kind of keep building. And we're still thinking about exactly how to get that right. Our PhD students increasingly are getting engaged to the point where we're trying to think about our capacity to manage that. And we need to keep building that. But the last thing I will say by way of welcome and introduction is just what year we're in. So we're in 2024. That's right. 2006 was the very famous Nuffield inquiry on empirical legal research, law in the real world, spoke about lots of important issues, critical mass, funding, methods, and so on. In 2026, that'll be 20 years, which also corresponds with it. Anyway, I just leave that thought with you about 2026 and empirical legal scholarship, the bicentennial of the institution, Dame Hazel Genn, who will talk to you. These things all seem to point to you, as well as the body of work you're going to talk about today. So that is my introduction. Welcome, enjoy this afternoon. I hope you have lots of wonderful thoughts, and I'm sure you will. And we need to keep doing more of this. So thank you, Pascoe.
Thank you. Thank you, Eloise. And I won't retread that importance issue. I think all of us here today feel that very, very strongly, and the need to keep supporting and growing empirical methods. Just a couple of housekeeping points before we move on. We've got 3 sessions, as you know, and we will have between them short gaps. Outside, there are a series of posters that have been created by the final year Law and Social Inquiry students. I'm very pleased to see in the room also, and they'll be presented out in the CCG area, and so I would ask you to take an interest in them in the break, have a look at them, and ask questions. Sorry, guys, ask questions and challenge, because in empirical methods, as I'm sure we're going to hear from Hazel in a moment, that it's very important to be constantly challenging and being critical of what you're engaged in. There are so many issues with empirical work in the real world, and attaching it to policy and having it being impactful, that none of us has ever done a perfect project. And so it's important to understand that, but also to engage with that process and be open to that constructive criticism. So get out there and challenge those. Sorry, guys. Sorry. But, and then at the end, you're all welcome also to stay on. We have a reception at the end. And so anybody who would like to stay and mingle and chat and catch up and talk methods, then that will be the opportunity to do so. Anyway, the first session, and it's a real great pleasure and a privilege as always to sit next to Hazel. She's really been a mentor of mine for many years now, and has done so much for me in my own work. So I always feel very humbled and intimidated also, because I've never had the right way. But the idea of this first session is to give an insight just into, and I think this is a common story, and this might be something that we come back to later also in the day in the Q&A at the end, is that the empirical researchers who are sort of prominent within the faculty and more broadly have very rarely taken a sort of standard route in. And that's one of the things that I think is interesting to explore, and that's the theme I'm going to sort of start out with in asking Hazel about her empirical journey. Is the different starting points that people have very much frame the types of projects, the types of interests, the types of methods, and also creates incredibly, Eloise was pointing to it, it's an incredibly diverse environment and culture within which we are. There is a huge range of social sciences that can contribute to empirical legal work, and each of them have their own approaches and methodologies, and so having a sense of how they interact and how you navigate through them is, I think, really important for us to, within our own little areas, to have an understanding of how other people got where they are, and where they're coming from, and why they're using the approaches that they use, which are often very different from the approaches that we use. So it's sort of that sort of insight. That's because otherwise it feels a little bit voyeuristic. So, by way of introduction, if you need an introduction, you've got the full Dame Hazel, which if we could, those are loads of letters, but there's not enough room on the card to put all those. How many LLDs have you got? I don't know. But you're a member of the Committee of Standards in Public Life, and Secretary of State's Advisory Panel on Judicial Diversity, 12 years Judicial Studies Board, 8 years Deputy Chair of the SRC Research Grants Board. I mean, the list is enormous, fantastic, and you're titan in the field. So that's the last thing I'm going to say by way of.
Dear, oh dear.
Yeah. So now live up.
Intimidating topic.
Live up to that now. So yes, but you didn't start out. I mean, you're known. You're sort of synonymous with civil justice, but you didn't start out in civil justice. You didn't start out in justice. You didn't start out in law. No. So where did you start?
There was no grand plan. People would say to me, how did you plan your career? I didn't plan my career. I don't think I planned almost anything that I did. I often seized opportunities. The only thing I did plan, and I was trying to think about this when I saw your questions, I knew early on that I wanted to do social science. I made a choice between doing piano, because I was actually quite a good pianist, where I was going to go down a kind of musical route, or social science. And in the end, I decided to go down social science. So I knew I wanted to do social science. And for some reason, I was always very interested. First of all, I'm very practical. So I was interested in how things work and how the world works. I was also interested in social justice. And I think it probably comes from being one of 3 sisters that I was at the time, and being kind of in the middle of things all the time. And anyway, that doesn't matter. But I knew I wanted to do social science. So I went to university and I did a joint degree in sociology, social anthropology, and what was called social administration in those days, which is kind of social policy. And during the course of that, I learned, because I'm so old, I won't tell you how old, but in those days, sociology was very, very much quantitative, and they were only beginning to talk about something called ethnomethodology. And I was taught at 9 a.m. in the mornings, I'm going to tell you, statistics right the way through my 3 years of sociology, not always at 9 o'clock in the morning, but we were taught hard, quantitative social research methods. So a big part of what I was studying was social research methods, theories of the method, the kind of underlying theories of the different methods. There wasn't much emphasis on qualitative research or ethnographic research. It was only really just getting to be recognized as any kind of social science, and I'm not sure it was even thought of as social science, although we did I did spend a lot of time doing witchcraft among the Azandi in social anthropology, which I loved very much, and looking at chickens' entrails and things, which I thought was fascinating. So they were interesting courses, and you could do things like political science and psychology as side issues. And so I was very much a social scientist, but I knew early on, and I don't really remember when, that I wanted to do research. I wanted to go on and do research. I can't remember how I formed that view, but I decided, yes, this is something I want to do. I liked research methods. I was interested in it. I am a data gatherer, and quantitative social science actually appealed to me hugely, because it's a way of understanding how things work. And I did all of that. And at the end of the degree, I wanted to do a master's degree, because I thought that was the only way you could become a kind of research person and academic. And this is how things are not planned. After the first term, I saw an advertisement in whatever, I can't remember what the publication was, an advertisement for a research assistant at the Institute of Criminology in Cambridge. So a research assistant who knew social science research methods. And I applied for the job and I got it. And my supervisor at Nottingham, where I was doing the master's degree in social science, said, if you leave this course, you can kiss goodbye to any kind of academic career. This will be death. And in the end, I did a moonlight flit. Not everybody knows this. I literally just abandoned the course and went down and I took up my post as a research assistant at the Institute of Criminology in Cambridge. And so that's how I got sort of into the law thing. It was an opportunity. It was a job. It was a research assistant job. And they needed somebody who had a research methods background.
So it could have been anything.
It could have been anything. It just happened to be that. And it was a research assistant on the first national survey of victims of crime, about which I knew very little, although I had done criminal justice. I'd done penal policy as part of my course, so I knew a bit about criminal justice system. And it wasn't I was particularly attracted by victims of crime. I wanted a research job. They needed somebody. I went for an interview. They offered me the job, and I just took it because I thought, well, this is what I want to do. And if I can get this job without having a master's degree, fine, that's fair enough. I was very, very fortunate to have a director of the principal investigator on that project, who had been funded by the Home Office. It was a 2-year or 3-year project funded by the Home Office. A man called Dick Sparks, who sadly who has passed away, who was both extremely good at quantitative social science, was a very good criminologist. Anybody who's done any criminology will have read Sparks and Hood, because he worked with Roger Hood. He was also tremendously lazy. Nobody heard me say this, but he used to spend quite a lot of time socializing down the pub. So I had an opportunity to do a huge amount of work. And basically the survey required survey skills. You had to draft surveys, produce the surveys, and then do quantitative analysis. And I learned how to apply the quantitative methods that I had learned at university on the job. And I can tell you now, this will tell you how old I was, how long ago this was, or how old I am now, which is that I was taught that Dick Sparks taught me to write Fortran. So I learned to code writing Fortran on a hole punching machine. People won't even know what that is, but you had cards. You'll know, Cheryl. You're not as old as me, but you'll know. You'll know. And I learned to code, and I learned how to analyze data with using SPSS. But you had to do the coding, and then you would take all of your cards, because you'd punched all of these cards with rubber bands, and I'd walk across to the computing centre in Cambridge, hoping that I didn't trip over dropping the cards. And I walked to the computing centre, and to do a crosstab or a series of crosstabs, they would run overnight. And so you wouldn't discover until the next morning if you'd missed a comma or put a space in the code in the wrong place. So you would know when you went in the next morning, if you had a big pile of printout. I mean, this is unbelievable nowadays, but if you had a big pile of printouts sitting there, thank God it worked. If there's a little pile of printout there, it would just say kind of coding error somewhere, and you had to do it all over again. So that's a very long way of answering your question, but that is how you learn to do quantitative social science. So you learn the theory, you read the books, but if you work with somebody who knows what they're doing and who is excellent at it, but doesn't want to do it themselves, they want you to do it. He was very good at showing me how to do the things I had to do. And I did everything. I was forced to do everything from the beginning. He designed the analysis and he would design the sampling, but I had to do all of the other stuff. And I learned from him. I went out and did interviewing. And it also led to, I did a period of ethnography where I moved in with a family in a housing estate in Hackney, where they were experiencing what was defined as unusual experience of clusters of crimes. So they were called multiple victims. And this didn't work within the kind of conceptualization of victimization. People think, or in those days, they thought about people as living largely crime-free lives, where occasionally is punctuated by, if you got bad luck, by somebody coming into your home and stealing your things or breaking into your car. The fact of the matter is, as we all know, and anybody who's done the Access to Justice course knows that, there are people who face complex challenges, people on low incomes who have a range of vulnerabilities, who have complex challenges, and among those things that they will experience is crime victimization. And this didn't fit with the model that we had. So these people who were having, say, 12 to 15 experiences of victimization in the last year were mucking up our kind of models or our theories for analysis. And so I was sent down to work out what was going on and re-interview. And in the end, I moved in. And the fact of the matter is, unsurprisingly, for many people, being a victim of crime is a way of life. Sometimes you're a victim, sometimes you could be the perpetrator, but it was part of life. And it was only by living there for a bit that I actually began to understand that you really got an understanding of how these clusters occur. And I think that was actually the beginning of my kind of interest in access to justice-y things. Anyway, so that was a very long answer to your first question. I use up the time now.
The more that you speak and the less that I do, that's good interviewing, isn't it? That's
Actually, yeah.
So,
getting myself to shut up as an interviewer is one of my biggest challenges.
Yes, and mine. So well done. Keep going. I mean, there's two things that are fascinating in that. When looking at it from now, the perspective of now, and that's kind of where I want to be ending up. But there's two things within what you're talking about. There's the unfinished part of the story, because that gets you to the Institute of Criminology and you're doing crime. But where we started out is you're synonymous with civil justice, not with criminology. And I'm going to ask you the question sort of straight, which is, was that another job? Was that another job advert?
Absolutely,
okay,
totally.
So.
I was, as I said, this is the best planned career anybody ever had. Yes. And actually, I'll tell you about how I ended up at Queen Mary, which is another job advert.
But we can certainly get to that. But the other thing that's fascinating there is that is that nowadays more and more, as I think across all disciplines, you have this real movement, and professions, you have this real movement towards specialization, and people become very associated with very particular approaches and methodologies. And you talk at the outset about the hard quantitative training, and you went to the institute, and it was survey work, and it was quant stuff, and it was, you know, the early days of SPSS, and like I remember, not even a few years ago, you still would put the analysis, the complicated stuff, and wait for it overnight. And so we really moved unbelievable distance. But then suddenly you're living in somebody's house. I mean, that doesn't sound like quantitative.
No, it wasn't.
You have done studies using a whole range of different. You're obviously very famous for survey work, but that anthropological participant observation. You've done observations. You've done interviews, and I think when I first met you, you were engaged on a qualitative project, and my first impression was, you're a qualitative researcher, and now the picture is very, very different in my mind. But how did you end up, doing such a diverse array of methodologies, and how did you? I suppose there's a few things in there, which is, well, did you just learn on the job? I mean, was it specific training leading into them, and then at the end of it, did you find a preferred approach?
I think that my experience there is, and I use it when I talk to PhD students who are sort of thinking about what methods to use, that at the end of the day, the methods that are most appropriate are those that fit the questions that you need to answer. And if you think about what I was doing, so we were trying to quantify victims of crime. How many people experience criminal victimization? What do they do? How many report to the police? What happens? What came up in that was this kind of odd phenomenon of these clusters of people. How is it that we have these groups of people? I can even still remember now, some of them look at me thinking, how can you have 12 instances of different kinds of crimes in a year? And so the question is how, it's not how many, but it's how and why. So if you're asking how and why questions, actually quantification will only take you so far. If you're trying to get a deeper understanding of certain processes, you need to ask you need to use different methods, and to ask different, you're asking different kinds of questions. And that's why, and it's that experience, and to that extent, I would say pretty amateur at that, to the extent that, again, don't listen to this, but actually I had a secret tape recorder in a thing that I was wearing one evening when I was sitting with the family. I mean, I would go to prison for this now. Don't anybody tell anyone. I put a secret tape recorder in my pocket so that because you couldn't sit and take notes when you're sitting with the family, just kind of chatting about what goes on. And I had a secret tape recorder, and I didn't realize it did a beep when it got to it, because again, this is old technology, and it did a beep. And then I was sitting there one evening and this thing went beep. There's this sort of, what was that? Oh, I don't know, what was that? I don't know, idea. But the result of that was that I actually had tapes, and I actually did a little chapter about what it was like sitting in those circumstances. But anyway, I was very amateur at the quali side. I mean, I knew from the anthropological stuff that I'd done what the methods were. It wasn't participant observation, because I wasn't really a participant, but I was doing ethnographic work. It was absolutely fascinating, incredibly revealing, and helped my understanding of clustering. And I think that experience led me all the way to feeling that the best, depending on what you're doing, depends what your questions are, but depending on what your questions are, a combination of methods. So you get the hard quantitative stuff that helps you provide that kind of numerical understanding of a phenomenon of something, which is also very important for policymakers, because otherwise it's just a story. So if you've got that, but then if you get to my preferred approach, and this is what we did in Paths to Justice and yours, is you do qualitative research first. So you do qualitative interviewing first of all, to get a sense of how you should be refining the questions for any kind of survey questionnaire, because you only get one, the questions on the questionnaire are set and you can't change them, and so they've got to be right. So you need to keep trying that out, piloting, refining, and doing all those kinds of things. So my preferred way of doing it is a bit of quali, quant if you need it, and then you look at the quant stuff, you look at what's coming out of that, and you say, what is it I don't understand? What do I need to know more about? What is going to put flesh on these bones? What's going to make this real? For all different kinds of audiences. So what is it that the policymakers want? They need numbers, but they also nowadays increasingly want captivating, engaging stories, narratives about phenomena. But so for me, you need both. And one of the studies that I did that I'm actually really pleased about, but doesn't get that much profile, and you didn't even mention it when I'd forgotten about it, was a study of diverse users in tribunals. We were trying to work out whether or not people from ethnic minority backgrounds had worse experiences, but also worse outcomes in a range of tribunals, and also what their perception was of their treatment in the tribunal. And that started with qualitative research. We had structured questionnaires for claimants, we had structured questionnaires for judges. We also did observations, structured observation in the court, watching what happened and actually noting down what kinds of interactions were taking place, what the judges were doing, what the claimants were doing. So really structured observations, which I hadn't done before. So we had kind of they were observations, but we could quantify things that went on in the observations. The other thing that we did that I thought was absolutely brilliant at the time, I still think it was good, is we were interested in perceptions of fairness, and we were interested in the extent to which the outcome influences one's perception of fairness. And so what we did was interview the claimants before they went in, watch them during the hearing, and between the end of the hearing and getting the decision, we interviewed them about their experience in the hearing when they didn't know what the outcome was going to be. Did it feel fair? Did you feel as though you had an opportunity to be heard? Did you think they were listening to you? All of those kinds of questions that you'll be familiar with if you've done anything on fair hearings. And then we would talk to them again when they knew the outcome. Do you think the outcome was fair? Do you think the hearing was fair? And do you think the outcome was fair? And the extent to which that affected their perception. And I don't remember it as precisely as I should. I didn't have time. I was going to reread it and I couldn't remember. But there's no doubt that receiving a poor outcome changes people's views a bit about the fairness of it. But it didn't. But before the outcome, on the whole, the perceptions of the hearing were generally very positive. They felt that they were dealt with in a very positive way. There were some things that were negative, but they were generally positive. But for me, and then what we did was to do a kind of quantitative analysis of the outcomes, looking at ethnicity and all the rest of it. And we did find some differences, but as a mixture of methods, that was, I think it was really interesting to do. I felt it was a really comprehensive approach to what was a really important question. So
those mixed methods and the idea of triangulating, get different perspectives, but also that sort of ordered approach where you need to be able to investigate some aspects, some questions before you can move on to other questions. The way you just said it sounds familiar. I'm quite appalled when I look back at some of the things I did early in my career, which, if you use the word amateurish, I would apply that to myself. But when you talk about mixed methods projects, more recent examples, you're working with teams. You started out in a team in the Institute of Criminology, but what has your experience been of working with others, drawing in people with other specialisms? Because that's something that seems to have changed over the years, in that now there would be much more of an expectation, maybe, that you would have people who know about the particular approach required for each aspect of a project, or is that?
No, I think I think that there are things that you can learn and things that you need to know. So, for example, talking about that same project, I was looking for a research assistant on the project, and I wanted somebody who understood methods, who understood research methods. And for me, it was not critical that they would understand the tribunal system, because you can learn it. You could learn that. What I needed was somebody who was good on methods, who understood what needed to be done, who understood the need for rigor, whether you're doing whether it's qualitative, whether it's particularly the observational stuff and the structured questionnaire. I needed somebody who could do that, and I also needed people who were better than me at stats on doing the outcome stuff. So recognizing that, so interestingly, the research assistant that I chose came from geography, because sadly, as is still the case, if you're looking for a lawyer with really strong quantitative social research skills, you can go on looking, because they are few and far between, and those that have them have come from sort of strange backgrounds. And I thought, I'm not going to find somewhere, or I'm unlikely to find somebody who has a really comprehensive understanding of the justice system and tribunals, and who has brilliant social research methods. So I took a geographer. The research assistants came from all over the place, and that what they needed were a range of skills, but an understanding of the justice system. They need to understand the project and what the objectives of the project were. They didn't need to understand the totality of the justice system. And for helping me with the analysis, I used an economist. I think it was an economist, Paul Fenn. I think it was Paul Fenn, yes. So it was an economist who was very good at better than me at multiple regression analysis and those kinds of things. So I think you need to know, as a researcher, you need to know where your strengths are, where you need to develop your strengths, and where you haven't got the time to develop those strengths, you get the experts in. And I genuinely think that there are lots of kind of allied social science subjects where students are taught good social science research skills. They may not know about the justice system, but they know how to do research projects. And I would always say, if you can't get a kind of an oven-ready empirical socio-legal researcher, then look at other allied disciplines where social science is strong. So psychology, geography, some bits of political science, well, political science. There are other places to look.
I think that was a very eloquent answer to the question that I didn't phrase quite so eloquently, but that's exactly what I was sort of really wanting to sort of dive into, is that, but I think that there's much more of an expectation now. And when I was first working with you, I mean, the Oxford Centre, which is where you went from criminology into civil, I thought, oh, that's how it is. You get all these experts from all over. You've got the economists, you've got political science, you've got all the geographers, all these people from different disciplines, and then they're all in a building and they all talk to each other and they work out these projects together. But that's not always the case, and that's not always been the case. So, how is, this is a big question, but it's sort of getting to the heart of something that's important that you've been very close to with the Nuffield report, got a mention. But just how have things changed over the years? Because my sense is that there's a lot more rigor around now, and that there is a lot more specialism. But I mean, how's that journey happened?
Well, I think there is more. I think the people have realised that empirical legal research needs to be more rigorous than it was. And I think that a lot of people, if you look back at quite a lot of the work that was being done, and I include myself in that, a lot of the people were relatively amateur of what they were doing, applying social science research methods to the justice system. And also, I don't think that research methods were as sophisticated as they are now. We didn't have the techniques, we didn't have the kind of, the kit to do the things that we can do now. There wasn't much of an interest in experimental. So there was never much of an interest in experimental techniques. And I was actually never taught experimental techniques. And I think that's probably more the case in psychology. I think there has been a change in terms of a greater focus on rigor. I still think there's way too much sloppy qualitative research being done because it's easy and it's cheap to do. And I think some of it is quite weak, and it gets qualitative research a bad name. I think there are still far too few people who have kind of a background in the law and legal training who actually have social science research methods, an ability to do empirical research and to do it well. And it is a great sadness to me that the Centre for Socio-Legal Studies did not do what it was supposed to do, which was to act as a catalyst for other centres to develop like that. So you can find, if you look at where the people from the Centre for Socio-Legal Studies landed up, they landed up all over the place, but did they create around themselves those kind of critical masses of empirical legal research with people drawing in people from different disciplines? They didn't. I mean, here we have managed to get a critical mass, but I think we still struggle to engage the attention. This is what enough of the inquiry showed. We struggle to engage the attention of political scientists, whereas in the States, political scientists are all very much interested in the justice system for other reasons, but they are. We don't get political scientists, economists. Really, they're interested in health, but they're not interested in the justice system, as far as I can see. Although there are so many questions that economists could be addressing. Geographers don't, they'll look at all kinds of things, but they don't necessarily look at the justice system. There has been work in psychology, and there was a kind of law and psychology stream of work which somehow hasn't kind of blossomed in a way. The only area that I would call is kind of large, a bit more multidisciplinary, is in criminology, where they will draw in other disciplines in criminal justice. But as far as civil justice is concerned, nobody's interested. We are interested, obviously, but there has never been the kind of interest in civil justice that there has been in criminal justice, and there are lots and lots of reasons for that. But I don't think that we've made the strides that I would have hoped by now. We've made how many thousands of years on it is from the Centre for Socio-Legal Studies, and the centre itself. It still does its thing, but it hasn't had the impact that it should have had in creating critical masses. If you try and think, where are the critical masses of empirical legal scholars around the country? There are some pockets that focus on family law, pockets in criminal law, but where are the pockets on civil justice, or on things outside of family and crime? And it is a real difficulty, because there are so many questions. There's so much that we don't know about how the justice system operates in relation to a wide range of civil justice areas. So I don't think we're anywhere near where we ought to be. If that was your question, I'm sure it was.
Yes. Well, I'll take credit for questions that I haven't asked.
Okay, good.
But I suppose there's a short question and a more interesting question. But I mean, the short one is UCL unusual? Do you see it like UCL as being unusual in that there is something of a critical mass emerging?
I think that we are. Don't you think? I think we are. I'm looking at my colleagues here, but I think that we are. I think we do have more of a critical mass. I struggle to think of other institutions that have the kind of critical mass of research that we're continuing to build on, that informs what we do, and also to have a dean, she's gone now, but I'll say it now, that is kind of committed to supporting empirical research. And as she said at the beginning, and this is a problem, she said it's not easy for a law school because of all of the pressures on law schools. It's not easy for law schools to accommodate empirical legal scholars, because everyone thinks it's wonderful to get a research grant. Everyone should think it should be wonderful to get a research grant. What that means is that it can take people away from their teaching, because their time is bought up, because empirical legal research takes time. And it takes a lot of time. Karen, I don't know how much of your time it's taking, but it takes loads of time. And it's not just data collection, it's data analysis. And so you have to have heads of law schools who are sympathetic to that, who can see the value of it for the law, for society in general, but for the law school. And I think it's really great that Eloise has certainly, I was keen to create and maintain some kind of critical mass, and that Eloise has really taken this on as kind of a strategic priority for the faculty. So I think it is unusual. It's unusual. You don't find it in the States anyway, but because it's all postgraduate law. And in the States, where you find centres like this, they tend to be more in kind of political science and those sorts of areas. So yes, I think we are unusual. I think there are some other little pockets around the place, but I don't think that there are lots, unless anyone else knows of any. No.
There are two themes in there, and one is they're related. One is about the challenges. I mean, you alluded to it. This is not easy stuff. You can't just sort of go and decide, oh yes, well, next week I'll quickly do a empirical study on X and then move back to what I was doing before. So there's the challenges, which I'm interested in, you know, as you've experienced them, as you've been doing projects, but also just before that, this criminology has been around for a long time as a discipline, and it has drawn in from many other disciplines and has a sort of clear focus for its work. Why do you have an idea of why nothing has we don't have a civilology?
Well, there is no civilology. There is no civilology, and if you think about it, and I've written about this quite a lot. So if you talk about criminal law, crime and criminal law and the criminal justice system, people can visualize it. You've got criminal, there are different kinds of crimes, but you've got, you know, the defendant and you've got the state. I mean, there are obviously some differences in that, but you can visualize it, you can draw it, and people can draw a picture of the criminal justice system. Try and draw a picture of everything that is not the criminal justice system. You've got family law, you've got civil commercial, you've got administrative law, you've got a whole range of other things. So you don't have the same kind of system. You have different kinds of configurations of party. It's so much messier outside of crime to even describe the system. And if you talk about the bit of it that you're interested in, it's quite difficult. So where people have been interested in things outside of criminology, they focused on things like legal policy, things like legal aid. So that's why access to justice has a sort of coherence to it, although at the end of the day it doesn't really mean anything, because what is it about? But you can't talk about civilology. You can talk about family law, you can talk about housing law, you can talk about various different kinds of law. It just doesn't have the coherence that criminology seems to have. People understand criminology. Also, criminology, crime, prisons, everything to do with crime has there's political interest and power behind that, and money behind that, and much more money going into research in criminal law because of the cost of the cost of running the criminal justice system and dealing with prisons and the like, all of those kinds of things. So I think it's the lack of coherence, and I've tried myself to describe it, and all I've ended up doing is describing the problem of trying to describe how there isn't one field outside of it. And whenever I was having a conversation just the other day with somebody from the Ministry of Justice, they've got a strategy day on next week and they want to say something about something, and they were saying, so, you know, what we're looking for is the model. And I said, there cannot be one model when you're thinking about the vast range of systems, processes, people, configurations of parties, the way that we organize things outside of crime. You can't have one model. It's very, very difficult. And I think that is just a fact. And it's not just a fact here, it's a fact elsewhere.
And of course, in the paths to justice research, you have to sort of grapple with that in how you present. When you were starting out with the crime victim survey, explaining to somebody what that survey is about doesn't take you very long.
No.
Whereas trying to explain what a survey of justiciable problems is, I mean, it seems that fragmentation is sort of central there, and that's a challenge for the civil side of empirical legal. But if I can take it to, and I'm looking at the clock, because I want to leave a little bit of time for some questions, but I do want to ask about the challenges of actually doing the work and what have been what have been the frustrations within projects and the difficulties that you faced that, have exemplified that?
The difficulties that I've faced in projects have been, first of all, the lack of data collection outside of crime. So there are no data on things, the failure of the many different, the tribunal system, the family system, not so much family system, because I don't do that much family, but all of the different bits of civil. There are no, you're looking for data sets. There hardly are any. So there are no data. And there aren't even any good computer systems for collecting data. They're trying to do it now. So I had to stitch everything together myself. And so whenever I was trying to collect information about cases and case outcomes, I was literally sitting on the floor of court basements with piles and piles of files, extracting data by hand, because you weren't allowed to do anything else, by hand onto kind of coding paper. So the time that would take, which today, or even then, if any of these court system had actually collected decent quality data about what they were doing, it would have made my life much easier. So we were having to basically construct data from scratch. So the time that it takes, the anxiety when you're doing quantitative research about getting the numbers right, particularly when you're doing complex things like paths to justice. I barely slept through some of that analysis, trying to work out, are you talking about a case? Are you talking about a person? Are you if you're trying to follow a person's journey through the justice system and all of the various diversions that there can be, getting those numbers right. And as a quantitative social scientist, if your numbers are not right, and if you don't have confidence in your numbers, and you're not confident about the rigor of it, you're dead in the water, because you can't. First of all, if you make a huge mistake, no one will trust you afterwards. And secondly, you can't bang the table to policy people unless you feel really confident about the evidence that you've got. And so for me, for me, making the research as rigorous as I could possibly make it, as objective, knowing all of the things that I knew and all the self-reflection about the fact that nothing is objective at the end of the day, making it as rigorous as I could make it, being as careful as I could be about not letting my interpretation, about keeping my interpretation as rigorous as it could be and as objective as it could be, stick to the data. And that's why it's harder with qualitative stuff. Stick to the data, make sure you collect it in a way that gives you confidence, stick to the data, get the numbers right. Don't get the numbers right, get the get the computing right and all those kinds of things. So it takes time, and it is really demanding. And I used to think, couldn't I just sit down and write an article about contract law? Wouldn't it be easier than this? And sorry, any contract lawyers, yes, it jolly well would. It would be quicker. It would need to be rigorous as well, but it would be an awful lot quicker than trying to collect large quantities of data, worrying about response rates, worrying about all of those kinds of things, and then making sure that you've got the numbers right, and you've inputted it right, and you've done that, and you do it and redo it and redo it and check it and validate it, all of those kinds of things. It's hard work. It's very, very, it's very demanding. It's tremendously rewarding. And I actually really miss doing it. I don't have the time. I haven't done an empirical project for absolutely ages.
To give an idea of just how time to Past Justice. When did you start work on Past Justice?
I think I started work probably about 1995, 96, something like that.
And that goes through to
and it was finally published. No, it was published in 1999.
And then still going.
Then the Scotland one was after that.
So
it took a long
4 years and 6 years if you look at, so not quick.
And I can still remember walking, nearly being run over, walking from the LSE to here, because I'd had a meeting with Michael Zander, or lunch with Michael Zander, and he'd said to me, do you know what? I was just looking, I think we were just about to publish or whatever, and I sent something. He said, do you know what? I looked at your diagram of the kind of, because I'd done this complex paths and things with the numbers in it. He said, I think you've got something wrong in there. and he about something on the numbers, and I walked from the LSE to here. I don't remember anything other than walking on thinking, oh my god, oh my god, oh my god, what have I got something wrong? And I really did nearly get run over several times. And I got back to my office and I sat down and I just went through it over and over again. And in the end, I was right. And I wrote to him and I explained why it was that I was right and he was wrong, and he accepted that he had misunderstood something. But it's that kind of, you don't get that with a contract, with writing an article about contract law or something like that. I don't think
that's a happy ending. I just a tip to pass over. I mean, I'm just working on a third volume of a report, so writing of a study in 3 volumes, and we pulled. It wasn't from the printers, but it was from the setters. We pulled volume 1 because we realised just before it went out that there were things we were going to say about what we were going to be doing in volume 3 that we realised we couldn't do. And so that anxiety I can absolutely relate to. I'm going to open up for a couple of questions, but I do want one last, because you set it out there as a little tantalising thing. So Queen Mary?
Oh, Queen Mary. So I was working in Oxford. I'd never lived in Oxford. I was commuting to Oxford. And I think my mother sent me, oh no, I can tell you exactly what it was. I was in Oxford and I thought, I will never be accepted by the law profession, by legal academia, unless I had done a law degree by then, unless I have taught law. And my mother sent me, she was very good at finding jobs. She sent me this thing that was for a lectureship in property law at Queen Mary. I thought, well, I can teach property law as well or as badly as I can teach any other area of law. And so I went to Queen Mary and I ended up teaching land law, trusts and constitutional law. And I taught land law at Queen Mary for, I think, 10 years, the 10 years I was there. And even when I was head of department, I couldn't let myself off teaching land law because we didn't have anybody else to do it. And when I came here, when I interviewed here, I said, I will come here on one condition, that I never, ever have to teach land law again. And I never have.
So
sorry about that. Any of the landlord.
Yes. Contract landlord. They're both
no contract. I didn't mind. I like
you've already given them some disrespect earlier.
Sorry.
So we've time for a couple of questions from the floor, if anybody would like to. I've got loads more questions.
Okay. Hazel, do you think that researchers care enough about bias?
I don't know. I do. I don't know that they do. And I don't think that, and when I'm talking about qualitative research, one of the things that worries me about is I often do a lot of reviews of quality research. And I think it's fine to do it, but you have to recognize the dangers of bias in it. And I could see it myself. And one of the things I used to do when I did qualitative interviews, and I would type out the transcripts because it was a way of getting yourself familiarized with it. And as a qualitative researcher, your eye is always caught by somebody who expresses something extremely well or an extreme case, and constantly have to be saying to yourself, no, what's the range? Where does this sit in the range? And I often used to do a kind of almost simplified quantification of what I was looking at. So actually is it a majority of people think that? Is it really, or am I misrepresenting? And I think that you have to be constantly reminding yourself of that. And it's true in quantitative research, but is especially true in qualitative research. And what I would like to see more of is people making less in the way of what looks like a very general, a generalization based on 3.5 cases, and saying, look, these are really interesting case studies, and these actually raise quite a lot of questions, and they're very interesting in their own right, but they are cases in their own right. We don't know what the average looks like. We don't know how representative these are of everything else. And so I think, and I do remember that in one of the many courses I did on research methods, and I used to teach research methods as well, constantly saying, you know, we all have our own prejudices, our biases. We all know how we would like it to turn out. You have to acknowledge that, recognize that, and be consciously working against it the whole time. And if you're really pleased with the finding, then go back and say, why am I so pleased? Is it right? Is that accurate? Am I right? And so I think people just need to be honest about it and to do everything that they can to mitigate. And I think there are much more in the way of software for qualitative research that I think that helps you nowadays that, again, didn't exist in the olden days when I was doing it.
Thank you. Oh, so we'll take, yeah, we'll take 2 questions.
Did you have any pushback from traditional research scholars, or what was their reaction?
Oh yeah, tons, absolutely tons, and not just those. I mean, so first of all, I don't even understand what it is you do, and then from the legal philosophers, well, you know what happens in fact is irrelevant. Cheers. I remember. I'm not going to say who.
So
but,
what?
So what? So I remember giving a seminar, and someone actually in this body, and a legal philosopher at the end said, "Yeah, but that's not really interesting. What actually happens is not interesting." I said, "Cheers! You've just kind of rubbished the whole of my academic career. I think actually what happens is quite interesting." So yes, I think that there are doctrinal lawyers who, and I can be interested in doctrine, but I'm not that interested in doctrine and doing doctrinal research, who don't really understand it. And so who don't value it. I would say that is less so nowadays. It's less so among, and I used to find the judiciary that's just a story. I mean, what's that? You know, they would think, you know, some members of the judiciary would think that, you know, their most recent case was the best evidence that they had of how the entire world works, which I don't think is necessarily the case now. So I think that people have a much better understanding of the value of social science research. Certainly had plenty of non-lawyers and medics say there is, you know, that's not even a science at all. Social science isn't even a science at all. But I think that there are law schools that are, if not anti, they certainly wouldn't be welcoming to doing this kind of research, for the reason I said, that they don't think it's all that important and that it takes people away from their teaching. It takes too long and it takes them away from their teaching. But I think there's a recognition that there's so much that we don't understand about how the justice system works and its outcomes that we need more of it.
And very quickly, last one.
It's a really similar question, actually, just the idea that you kind of spoke about the idea that you weren't taken seriously in legal academia, for example. And how much of that do you think has to do with the fact that doctrinal research kind of values the own internal kind of language of the law rather than what law is doing, or, you know,
yeah, I think
anything beyond that? And I found that myself, where it's kind of like, just because I'm not speaking that language, it invalidates.
I think it is. I think it is. There is a challenge that there are people who think that, you know, if you're interested in the law, you're interested in the law as it is written and as it is interpreted by the judiciary. I think that is less. There are more people who are more open to different approaches, as Eloise said at the beginning, to a diversity of approaches, and that there are things that we need to understand. But I think there will always be people who are actually not interested in the justice system, what it's there to do, what the law is there to achieve. Their focus is absolutely on what the law says. And what does this judgment tell us, or what does this interpretation tell us about what we have to do there? And there is absolutely a place for that. You absolutely need that. But what we need is a kind of mutual respect for doctrinal research, and for doctrinal researchers to understand that empirical legal researchers are asking different questions about the law, but those questions are no less important. They're just different. That's a work in progress, though, getting that kind of level of mutual respect.
Thank you, and we're a little bit over time, so we're gonna wrap up there, and just ask you to join me in thanking Hazel for those fascinating.
Thank you, and thank you for your interest in empirical legal research. And I would encourage you to keep going, because one of the things that it scores very highly on is originality. and impact, originality and impact. Because it really, it's very easy to be original doing empirical legal research, and it's less easy to be original in some areas of doctrinal research. So we're always going to have, and you're right, influence, impact in terms of policy. If you actually want to see things move, I think it can be highly influential. And even single smallish pieces of research can have quite an impact. So I would encourage you, despite the fact, first of all, it's fun, because you can't know how things work. So it's fun, it does take time, but it does have impact, and people do take notice of it, because it's always new. Nobody else has done it, hardly anyone's doing it. Anyway, with that, I shall leave you to have your
That's
tea.
the call to arms.
Call to arms.
Call to arms.
Oh, call to action, as people in the.
So we now have,
around
as I
the
say,
area
there's the posters to have a look at, and there's refreshments outside, and if we can be back here at past, and then we can move on with the second session. So let's get going with now. For the very observant in this room, you might have noticed that on my next trick, has anyone here been to Enemy of the People? No, at the Duke of York's? No. There's a very funny trick in it, which is asked of the audience, and it's I can turn any word into another word, and if you're very lucky afterwards, I will do that. It's an even better trick than that one was. So this is really the focal point session, and this is where we started out, because the idea is to have a conference which is for the students who are undertaking research in the faculty. We also have the students who've put together the posters really impressively outside, and the idea is to provide support and encouragement for empirical work from the undergraduates through the postgraduates, and involve faculty as well. But the focus is very much on supporting students and giving voice and exposure and a bit of prominence to the research that they are undertaking. And as each year has gone by, those of us who engaged in the PhD methods training courses have noted that there has been increasing interest in empirical methods, and also more students who are interested in undertaking empirical work. And so this is an opportunity to hear about some of the work that is being done. So I'm going to say nothing more than that, because as I demonstrated, I'm not very good at chairing sessions. I'm as good at this as I am at interviewing. Very amateurish in that, but quite good when it comes to sort of the hard quantity empirical methods, but we're not doing that today. So we've got three presentations, and I didn't think to write down actually. Do we have an order, or am I going to? Okay, well,
So Natalia.
okay, so we've got that sorted. So I'm very, very good at this. So we're going to start then with Natalia Morales Cerda, who is a PhD candidate in the faculty, and also a graduate lecturer in public law. And her work aims to analyze public law through feminist methodology. And as part of her PhD, she's exploring the experience of women's political representation in Chile's 2019 to 2022 constitution making process using semi-structured interviews. So I'll hand over to you, Natalia. Thank you.
So thank you very much. Okay, Thank you for the presentation, and thank you for organizing this. So in the next 10 minutes, I want to do 3 things. I want to explain the context of my research and the theoretical foundations of my research. Then I want to explain the methodological choices of my research. And finally, I want to talk a little bit of where I am going with this project so far. It's somewhere. So, the theoretical foundations. So, political representation is an essential component of constitutional democracy, right? However, today's constitutional democracy is based on a fixed standard account or a fixed narrative or model of political representation that has shown to have limitations. This conception of political representation does not function as modern theorists imagine it, right? Using the idea of the mandate as a way to conduct citizen interest, but also this standard narrative of political representation does not function as citizens imagine it, because this logic, this standard narrative of political representation create a distance between the representatives and the represented. So this conception of political representation is particularly problematic today in the context of a highly involved and critical citizens. Also, this conception of political representation does not include new or, let's say, emerging approaches to social relationships. For instance, the gender approach. For example, people who performing political representation today are in many significant ways not the same as those who performed political representation in past centuries, being gender one of the main differences. So those elements, the idea of critical citizens and the gender approach, are impacting particularly in the perceived legitimacy of representative relationship. So in this context, in this research, I propose to rethink the conception of political representation from a gender standpoint. So I am doing this through a case study. I'm studying the 2019-2022 Chilean constitution making process. For my research, it means that I am studying the Chilean process from a holistic point of view, considering the Chilean tradition, the Chilean constitutional tradition is developed in the last 2 centuries and in the context of the Latin American constitutional tradition. So I am trying to provide an in-depth account of the context in which the constitution making process took place. I understand this case study as an instrumental one, as something different, as an intrinsic case study. This because even though I think that through my research, I will be able to provide some sort of explanation of the failure or kind of the mistakes in the Chilean constitution making process, my aim is not fundamentally to understand the case, but to provide insight into the issue of political representation, or particularly on the representative relationship, or try to refine a theory of the idea of representative relationship. I am using a grounded theory research strategy. It means that the explanatory theory is developed from the data, and the aim is to start the analysis by finding concepts or categories in the data, not by bringing the concepts or categories into the data. So this approach aims to generate a theory. No upfront theory is proposed, and no hypotheses are formulated for testing in this research. In this kind of research, the literature is used to guide the study and to show the lack of a theory to explain particular aspects of the representative relationship that are not covered by the dominant theories today. And I will provide some examples of these to support my methodological decisions later in my presentation. Also, I am adopting a feminist standpoint approach. It means that this research is politically engaged with three ideas. First, knowledge is socially situated. Second, marginalized groups are socially situated in ways that make it more possible for them to be aware of things or ask questions than it is for non-marginalized people. And research, particularly that focus on power relationships, should start with the experiences and the life of marginalized people. It means that this is relevant when I am asking whose experiences is to count in creating knowledge. And then the question, using this epistemological approach, is why to analyze specifically the Chilean case. I think that the Chilean case is important to analyze for three things. First, the standard account of political representation is captured in the ideas and practices of representation in both the Chilean constitutional tradition, but also in the constitution-making process. Second, Chile shows a strong case of critical citizens, especially because of the expansion of the middle income groups. And these I'm using these are examples of how I am using the grounded theory approach, because here I'm using the category of critical citizens, as Pip and Norris does it when studying how social movements or critical in general, or citizens in general engage with social movements. And third, this process is the first to draft a constitution through an elected body with gender parity, including the principle of parity in the overall design of the process. So, in short, I think this is an ideal case to reflect the theoretical concern I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation. I am using semi-structured interviews to do this. Yeah. And the question is why? Why I am using this method? One of the advantages of this method is that it allows you to explore views and opinions more deeply and to really look into the experiences of the people who are taking part in the research. So the interviews aim to explore how women, members of the convention, understand and experience the representative relationship that they had with their voters. So I think this is consistent with the epistemological approach I have taken in this research. These interviews were based on a series of questions to guide the interviews. And these questions were constructed by combining diachronic elements, which is the time, and also synchronic elements, which is other elements different than time, to allow to construct a narrative through the interviews. The element of time is relevant because it allows to identify moments and to capture different realities of political representation in different moments. And in this, again, I am drawing on the theory. I draw on Mansbridge and Urdinati theoretical approach. Both of them, they have, like, I would say, the different approaches to the idea of political representation, but even though both of them understand the representation and the relationship of representation as a dynamic process. So that's why I'm using the time as one of the elements to guide the interviews. And the other element, the synchronic element, it's other element different than time. And in this case, I am interested in the characteristic of the relationship between the representative and the voters. So combining these two elements, I can identify 3 moments in the interviews, which are at the same time 3 different moments of the representative relationship as well. Before the election, during the work of the convention, and after the work of the convention, but before the referendum. So I conducted 25 semi-structured interviews between June and September in 2022. I did the interviews in this particular period because it was after the end of the convention, but before the referendum in which we finally rejected the draft of the constitution. So it's a very particular period to do the interviews. I think I'm going to skip the part of the sampling because of the time, but we can come back later on the sampling. But generally, it's I try to do a sampling to get a more or less representative picture of the composition of the convention, which consisted in 155 members, 77 of whom identified themselves as one. On the data analysis technique to generate meaning from the data involve the interaction of three components: data reduction, data display, and drawing conclusions. I am adopting a data-driven approach, and I think this is again consistent with my epistemological approach. And based on this idea, I identified three ideal types. So the idea is to take these ideal types to describe the representative relationship as a starting point and systematically enlarge these three distinctions: the motivation to engage in the process, the source of judgment or decisions, and responsiveness. So based on these ideal types, I am kind of struggling now, try to think where I am going now with this research, with the data or all the interviews I did. So far, there are like three main ideas I'm trying to develop on the last chapter of my dissertation, which is the idea of political representation without trust. And this seems to challenge the conventional role of trust in political representation, because if trust disappears, what remains at the end in the representative relationship? The second is the idea of self-representation, on how to understand the claim of self-representation, especially when coming from social movements. And finally, the element of absence. The idea of, is political absence simply the opposite of presence, or what does absence bring into the political or decision-making arena? So that's, very generally speaking, my own journey of doing empirical research. So it would be great to hear more questions or comments at the end. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think what we'll do is we'll hear each of the presentations, and then we'll take some questions at the end. So do you have a PowerPoint as well?
I don't have that.
No problem. Okay. So Sonam Gordhan, also a PhD student. I don't need to do the PhD student at UCL, really, do I? As well as departmental lecturer in environmental law at the University of Oxford. And the focus of her work is on understanding the role of courts in responding to climate change and drawing on case study methods to identify and select cases explored in her thesis. So over to you, Sonam.
Thank you. So today I'm going to focus on two main things. The first are the methodological challenges that I've encountered in conducting my project, and second, what those challenges have meant for the choices that I've had to make in terms of the methodology for my project. I don't claim to be a socio-legal scholar. I don't have training in empirical methods, but the nature of my project, the stage of the literature in my field, and the subject matter of my research, the cases that I'm looking at, have all pushed me beyond the boundaries of what we might understand as conventional doctrinal methods. But before I get into those reflections, I'll think about my project. So my thesis is about the relationship between the role of courts and climate change legal disputes, and in particular, I take the process by which courts resolve disputes and develop doctrine, that is their adjudicative method, and explore how this method is engaged in so-called case studies of climate case law. My objective with this exercise is to provide a thicker account of climate change adjudication, one that takes seriously the institutional nature of courts and also acknowledges the values, principles, and processes that inform how courts reason climate change problems, but also how they reason cases in general. So I developed this thick account by starting with the common law model of adjudication, which is a defensible, widely understood model of how courts reason cases. And I explain the complexity of the adjudicative process through relying on the common law method. I use this method to build an analytical framework and hone in on 3 core features of adjudication: dispute resolution, which is a core function of courts as adjudicative bodies, the doctrine of precedent, which is fundamental to how courts reason with authority, and the institutional and constitutional competence of courts, which delineates the scope of a court's legitimacy in its particular jurisdiction. I then use this framework to identify 3 case studies of climate litigation from a pool of apex court decisions concerning climate change legal problems. So I went through a process of understanding how we might define a climate case, and then trawled through Westlaw in order to collate the data, i.e. the case law. But each of these cases, which are the 3 that I focus on, was selected on the basis of their relevance for the analytical framework. So that is, each of them displayed particular importance or relevance for the specific feature of adjudication that was the focus of that particular chapter. So by way of an example, my case study that focuses on the institutional and constitutional competence is the Court of Appeal's decision in Finch and Surrey County Council. This is a judicial review of Surrey County Council's decision to grant planning permission for the construction of a well site for the extraction of crude oil. And the environmental impact assessment that was conducted in relation to that project did not include the downstream emissions of the inevitable combustion of that crude oil further down the line. And the claimants alleged that that meant that the decision by Surrey County Council was unlawful. Now, this case could be understood in any number of ways. If you were an administrative law scholar, you'd be focusing on matters of jurisdictional fact, you'd be looking at the Weatherspoon standard of review. Planning law barristers are up in arms about what this means for the obligations on local planning authorities. They're thinking about what this means for developers and the kinds of hurdles that they have to overcome in environmental impact assessment. Environmental lawyers are all very excited about what this means for the environmental impact assessment regime, including myself, particularly as it's on the cusp of major reform under the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act. But for me, in the thesis, the focus is on the institutional capacity and the constitutional authority of the court. And that's because this competence is often assumed in mainstream climate litigation discourse, that because courts should do something about climate change, they can do something about climate change. So the task that I have set myself is to understand what the competence of the court is, according to the framework that I have set out, which is based on the common law model, and how this manifests in a climate legal dispute as it's defined in the thesis. Now, Finch is an excellent example because at the heart of the case is a question about the proper role of the court in scrutinizing public decision-making. And all 3 of the judges in the decision took a different view on how this balance played out. A study of the case through the lens of competence shows that the Court of Appeal is primarily concerned with the statutory framework that it has been tasked with interpreting. It shows that the court is bound by principles of judicial review in this jurisdiction. It also shows that in the context of a problem like climate change, it is deferential in scrutinizing the reasons for a public authority to give permission for a planning project. Now, while all of this is clearly an internal perspective of the law, it does demand a contextualized understanding of the role of courts. It requires an understanding of the expectations that are placed on courts in relation to climate change problems. And it also demands some appreciation of the complexity of granting planning permission in relation to very difficult or emerging environmental problems. That means I'm inherently uncomfortable with calling this purely doctrinal in the way that doctrinal scholars might define the work that they are doing. So I use the term case study to describe the cases that I focus on in the thesis. And Stephen Vaughan has recently put it in an article at the JEL. The term case study seems to be used by some environmental legal scholars in an offhand way that would likely be alien to most social scientists. I am hyper-conscious of not being that person. But that said, the case study method has been instrumental in shaping how I engage with my legal material. Because to me, I've understood a case study as a real-world, in-depth investigation of a current complex phenomenon. And we rely on them in the social sciences for projects that seek in-depth research aimed at achieving a thick description of how or why something is as it is. They're not concerned with representativeness, but with information richness and purposeful case selection. And as I've explained, I'm concerned with developing a thick account of climate change adjudication. And doctrinal methods alone can't offer me with the methods that I need to engage with this issue. And that's for three main reasons. First, defining a climate case is inherently complicated. Climate change legal problems don't confine themselves to one area of tort, one area of contract, one area of administrative law. They don't sit in a neat chain of legal doctrine. So without this precedential string of case law to draw upon, as doctrinal scholars tend to do, challenges can arise as to how to select case law for analysis. There isn't an immediately obvious landmark decision in a particular area to hone in on. There is also a tendency to focus on exciting headline-grabbing cases for no reason apart from the fact that people are excited about them, which to me didn't seem like a good enough justification to focus on in the thesis. Second is the sheer volume and diversity of the field. So however you might define a climate case, these cases add up to the thousands and span tens of jurisdictions. It's not feasible to undertake a systematic analysis of each and every so-called climate case to develop a theory of climate change adjudication. And that means going deep and thick rather than broad and thin avoids the risk of making generalizations about what is an emerging and developing area of adjudication, but also of law. And third, my research objective is not to make a claim about what the law is or should be on a particular area of law relating to climate change. It's to illustrate and explain and understand the reasoning process of courts in the context of climate legal problems. So that means technically I am exploring a contemporary phenomenon in action. It's distinct to making a normative claim about how public nuisance should evolve in light of climate change. It's distinct to making a claim about how Wednesbury should evolve in light of the problems that arise between courts and public authorities. My focus is the role and nature of courts, and the purpose of my case analyses is to illuminate that complexity. But it wasn't as simple as saying, let's adopt the case study method, because when I did some digging and looked into case study methods, while case studies are often used in empirical legal research, I couldn't come across examples of legal cases being used as case studies in the way that I sought to engage with them. And not only that, but textual analysis of case law can easily just be understood as doctrinal research, rather than qualitative analysis that's backed up by rigorous methods. So while there are examples of legal cases being used as case studies, it's usually with a view to understand their social or political implications, rather than in taking, a view of the internal perspective of the court when reasoning these decisions. So I have had to exercise caution and admittedly a lot of agony over how I reconcile this crossover that I've encountered in doing my research. But really what it means is that I've had to be very careful and actively engaged with my methodological choices. And these choices haven't been static, they haven't been easy. It didn't feel good enough to say that I'm focusing on these three cases because they prove my point and they're interesting to me. It mattered that I was selecting them on the basis of informed choices about how I conducted the project. And as Fisher puts it, environmental law scholars need to explicitly recognize that they're making choices about how societies choose to know about environmental problems. And for me, I think I'm making choices about how society and the legal community chooses to know about legal institutions in the context of climate change. Because writing about courts and climate change is not a siloed doctrinal process that's divorced from its context. The role of courts is actually hotly contested, and everyone has a view on what courts and law should be doing about climate change. So that has just reinforced the fact that I've had to be very careful and reflexive about the choices that I make in conducting my project, just to make sure that the research is rigorous, that my case selection is properly justified, and that I'm properly engaging with how courts have been understood by lawyers, but also by activists and scholars in this field. So thank you to the case study method for helping with that task. But thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. And last but by no means least, we turn to Tasneen Ghazi, who is undertaking her PhD here, obviously, on comparative administrative law and looking at the use and scrutiny of delegated legislation across a number of jurisdictions. And she's previously worked in a think tank looking at this very issue. So over to you, Tasneen.
So I'm not using a presentation, but I do have two parliamentary reports that I'm going to have in the background. They're a bit unconventional. So I'm just going to stand while I do this, just because it's a bit easier. Okay, so my research is essentially about the extent to which the use and scrutiny of delegated legislation is consistent with our expectations. And so normally when you think of a lot of problems in public law, when you think of legislative process, we kind of think of it in the abstract. So a lot of the work that exists is descriptive. And what I'm essentially going to argue in the next 10 minutes is that you can't understand how delegated legislation is used and scrutinized without an empirical approach. But what I mean by empirical isn't necessarily quantitative, qualitative kind of research in terms of interviews or stats. What I mean by empirical is I'm focused on understanding how it works and looking at the same sources that you'd look at through doctrinal research, so case law, legislation, policy papers, and guidance, but in a different way. So not necessarily to understand, okay, what's the leading case on this, but how the same thing works in different countries and across different areas of law. So as you all know, delegated legislation is legislation created by the government, usually after Parliament gives away powers. And although traditionally when we teach constitutional law, we teach the separation of powers, we say that Parliament is the legislator. In reality, most of our laws are delegated. So everything from immigration rules to food and health standards, health and safety laws, most law is actually created by the government. And this has actually been seen as a very big constitutional problem. So the reports that I have in the background, one of them is about parliamentary expectations of delegated legislation. And the second is kind of a warning report. So last November, two parliamentary committees published two reports saying that the way in which delegated legislation is used and scrutinized has caused a massive and untenable shift away from Parliament and towards the government, and there needed to be a total reset. As you can tell just by the title, Government by Diktat, kind of the sister report called Democracy Denied, it was supposed to provoke a bit of a stir. So it was supposed to kind of indicate that the current system was no longer tenable. So the problem that I'm looking at from a research perspective is how is delegated legislation used and scrutinized in different policy areas? So normally so in this literature, there has been a lot of criticism of use, despite the fact that there is a very big gap in the literature. So most of the literature on delegated legislation is either by number of think tanks, 3 or 4 very prominent think tanks, or kind of by public law academics. In every single textbook on public law, you can probably find a chapter that describes the system and describes the main problems with it. So it won't tell you the extent to which it's relied on in different areas of law. However, if you go to speak to a practitioner in tax law, they'll tell you that in tax law, delegated legislation isn't relied on. So Whiteman and Sherry says that primary legislation is relied on primarily because of the rights issues. By contrast, if you look at McDonald, who speaks to an immigration law practitioner, they'll tell you that most of policy is in immigration laws, which themselves aren't delegated legislation, but this kind of sort of quasi guidance with legal effect. So what I'm trying to say is that we lack a very good understanding of the phenomenon of use and scrutiny, despite a lot of criticism. And my PhD, I'm not saying that I'm going to kind of address that big phenomenon, but my PhD is supposed to test whether those criticisms are fair and the extent to which they push a realistic expectation on use and scrutiny. So I start off with the assumption, looking at the second report, so just to give you a flavor of criticism, if you look at the summary here, the first what it says, Parliament is being asked to accept new ways of legislating. So we take the view that there's an urgent need to take stock and rebalance the relationship between Parliament and government because of the issue of too much deadline, right? But if you look at the second report on the electoral process, you can see that the Constitution Committee has a very clear idea of how delegated legislation should be used vis-a-vis primary legislation. The critical view that a lot of constitutional scholars and think tanks have pushed is that delegated legislation is only appropriate for filling in details, and that primary legislation, because of its legitimacy, because it receives more detailed parliamentary scrutiny, because parliamentarians can amend it, is appropriate for policy change. What I'm doing is I'm questioning that expectation in three different ways. The first way is through comparative analysis, right? So I'm comparing the issue of use and scrutiny in the UK to two other jurisdictions that are similar enough, but also a bit different. So I've chosen Ireland and Canada because they are Westminster style systems, so similar political forces are involved, but you also have very constraining constitutions. So Ireland has the non-delegation doctrine, where the courts can strike down primary legislation that delegates too much power. And in Canada, you have federalism, so legislation isn't just created by the central executive, but also by legislatures around the country. So the second way in which I'm looking at the use and scrutiny of delegated legislation is, I mentioned it before, is that we have different policy areas. But when we think of public law, we often think of constitutional, but actually the leading cases on public law, from GCHQ to Wednesbury reasonableness, they're not pure public law cases. Wednesbury reasonableness was about whether it was appropriate to restrict a cinema from opening on a Sunday. So conditions placed on the cinema opening on a Sunday, that cinema was essentially trying to argue that they should be allowed to show movies to children, and the local authorities restricting with the license. But the point I'm making is we think of public law as a final off day, but actually it's not. And my PhD tried to demonstrate the different ways in which delegated legislation is used in different policy areas that are all public law. So tax, because it's different and it's based on primary legislation. That's my first chapter case study. My second is immigration, because the source of executive power is different. So to an extent you have the prerogative in play, but also you have reliance on guidance. And I don't just mean the immigration laws, I mean you have to some degree kind of equivalent to extraordinary concessions, and you have policy manuals. And then my third case study, which is an exceptional case study, which is the use and scrutiny of delegated legislation during the pandemic. And I've chosen that because it's supposed to show that even though there's been a lot of criticism, is the emergency use of delegated legislation actually all that different from its use in an area like immigration? So basically, my PhD is trying to answer the question by looking into across different countries and across different cases. But that doesn't get us back to whether existing aspirations are fair. And so through my research, I'm not just talking about use generally. I have in each chapter, in the three kind of case study chapters, I trace the way in which delegated legislation, the way in which the policy, the way in which delegated legislation is used in the policy process. So what do I mean by that? I have a constant to political science terms. I have 4 constant policy goals, which I predict in order to be representative of existing expectations on the system. So the Constitution Committee has identified 4 examples of where that 4 examples of delegated legislation being inappropriate. So highly significant cases, cases involving rights, criminal penalties, imposing fees. The second is controversial cases, so politically controversial cases. The kind of famous example is the tax credits, which, and the third example is general, instead of being about implementing a certain thing. The third example they identify as being inappropriate is policy change. So they say that policy change generally should be implemented by primary legislation. And the fourth example is new policy. So through my case studies, I've selected them so that they encompass those 4 things that shouldn't be implemented by delegated legislation. And I look at how these goals are implemented in tax, in coronavirus, and in immigration. And my central argument is that it's unrealistic to say that delegated legislation can't be used through everyday to implement everyday policy changes, because it is, right? And that's not going to change anytime soon because it's in practice. So to step a bit, just to take a step back, what I'm doing is empirical in the sense that I'm looking at how the world works and I'm questioning principled assumptions about the system based on kind of data analysis of legislation, parliamentary papers, guidance, debates. But at the same time, I am engaging with the existing literature and I'm saying it's deficient because it's only ever descriptive and it doesn't explain how the law works. Yeah, I think that's.
Thank you. So I'm going to open up for just a very few questions because we have a very tight timetable, and as you can see, one of my areas of amateur endeavor is timekeeping, and so does anyone have any questions? Yes, Luke.
Yeah, I mean, that's basically my thesis. My thesis is despite a non-delegation doctrine in Ireland, despite federalism in Canada, they all use delegated legislation the same way. So it's not just about volume, but it's about tracing its role in the process. And I actually think it's worse in somewhere like Ireland, despite the non-delegation doctrine, because essentially everything gets done through guidance and delegated legislation rather than primary legislation. So the short answer is yes.
Excellent.
Thank you very much. My question is for Sonam. Yeah. If you could make a brief reference to the other 2 case studies that you're going to be addressing, just on how you pick them and what you're thinking.
Yes, so I'm thinking about this in order of the chapters that they're in. So the first case study, which is focused on dispute resolution. So the idea that a court is primarily tasked with resolving the dispute between the parties. I chose the New Zealand Supreme Court decision of Smith and Fonterra, which is a strikeout case, and really all about whether there is a legal dispute to even deal with. So the challenge was brought by Michael Smith, who is he's a Maori leader in New Zealand, and he claims that land which he has a customary interest in has been damaged by the effects of climate change, and he's suing 7 major emitters in New Zealand in public nuisance, negligence, and in a novel tort. The reason that I picked it to focus on dispute resolution is that is that really fundamental question of, well, what is it that a court is doing when resolving a dispute between the parties? It's identifying rights and duties. It's identifying correlative remedies to those harms that have been alleged. And actually, Smith is a really great example of a claimant having to craft that argument in terms that the court will understand and accept. The second case study is a now very infamous case. It's Friends of the Earth in Heathrow, which is a UK Supreme Court decision, and that's where I focus on the doctrine of precedent. And really what that case is about is UK administrative law and how it has evolved or hasn't evolved in response to issues like how do we account for the Paris Agreement when making decisions about the expansion of Heathrow Airport. But that's really grounded in ideas of, well, this is the application, the routine application of public law principles to a particular issue. It's grounded in ideas of stability. But actually, when it comes up against what is quite a dynamic policy space, the court really struggles with what stability really means in that context. So I thought that was a really good example of trying to situate the way in which precedent really informs and authorizes and legitimizes how a court reasons. But yeah, sorry, that was a very long answer.
Thank you. And one last question, and I say that because I've got one last question, and then we'll seamlessly move into the also quite amateurish being able to read the timetable of what we're doing. So we don't have 2 breaks. We're going straight into the next session. But the question I had was because I think it's quite different for each of you. It's just when in your thinking about your projects and when in the process of starting to undertake your research, when did the empirical element that you want to address, when did that sort of make itself apparent? Was it right at the beginning? Oh, I'm going to do something and it's going to be, or did it just sort of emerge? You want to go in the same order as
Yes, for me it was at the very beginning. And actually, my interest in doing empirical research started after I did my LLM. I say, okay, I want to do empirical research, but in public law. So I say, okay, maybe I need like kind of formal like approach to this kind of research. So that's why I decided to do a master in a faculty of sociology. I decided to do more socio-legal studies and particularly on gender studies, which is things I have been working for years. So for me, it was a very conscious decision. I want to work in doing empirical research, and particularly I want to try to understand the experience of the people I am working with. And I wanted to understand the Chilean constitution making process from the experience of the people actually involved in the process. So for me, it was from the very.
Thank you. Sonam?
For me, so the first task that Eloise sat me as for my first supervision was look at all the literature on climate litigation, categorize it into doctrinal, socio-legal, and jurisprudential. And I couldn't do it because all of it had a socio-legal dimension. So to say that all of this was doctrinal it felt impossible. And then that discomfort only increased when we had our research seminars on different methods. And I thought, I can't understand environmental law without some understanding of the context in which it's operating. So how is it that I could call myself a purely doctrinal scholar? But the idea of case studies came in after my upgrade, where Stephen suggested that I have a look at case study methods to explain how I was going about the project in this shape. So it was actually towards the end of my second year, so it was quite late in the process. Yeah.
I mean, I think I always knew that I wanted to have case studies, but I think I didn't think I would rely on my case studies to this extent until about the end of my first year. So I did my upgrade chapter my upgrade chapter was a case study chapter of the use and scrutiny of delegated legislation in immigration. And I've actually done a lot of the empirical kind of background data work towards the beginning of my PhD. So I suppose from the very start, I knew I was going to do quite a bit of empirical work, but that's also because I audited a couple of political science courses.
Thank you. It's kind of, that was my hunch. That's why, because I mean, they're very different points. And I think, you know, that's something that's quite a challenge from the researcher perspective, but also in terms of, you know, the sort of institutional support. And so it's good to hear that and to understand that. I think, Hannah, you had one. I'm sort of aiming now to sort of like start 1/2 in my be formulated, because I clearly don't know what I'm doing approach to the conference, but
you did 25 interviews. In terms of access and response, was it easy? Did you struggle to find people to interview? Did you have challenges to overcome in that respect? Did it work out as you wanted to?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it was easier than I expected. And I was really, I mean, I was actually really happy because after contacting the first 2 or 3 people, they told me, yeah, but I can talk to my other colleague and to give you her number. And I was particularly worried, to be honest, with the interviews for right political parties, right-wing political parties, because I went to uni with some people who were actually member of the convention, but from left-wing political parties. So for me, I have a more kind of close relationship with the left-wing political parties in my country, so it was easier to get access to that. But it was way more challenging to get access to members of right-wing political parties, also because I am from Chile, so they know me. They know, of course, I'm not pretending that and I cannot pretend that I have kind of neutral approach to this. But at the end, it was way easier than I expected. So.
thank you. And so I'll just ask everyone to show their appreciation for these 3 endeavors. Thank you. Excellent. The musical chairs. Yes. Yes, would you like to chair?
It's very helpful because I had a bit of trouble with it. The research in this.
I'll just leave it one. And then Cheryl's going to go now.
She's standing.
I think
I've got your presentation. I mean, I have to make it a short. But I've gotten a bit downstairs, so I'm going to run downstairs. But if you do want to watch it, you'll just need to share it through Zoom.
Okay.
Is that?
Yeah, I remember how to do that. Like you do know.
But it's on the desktop already.
So
I've got one. Oh, hello. Oh, there is a chair for me. I thought I was going to have to do sort of David Letterman on the.
Shuffled out.
Oh, great, thank you. I'm just going to project because I don't have a microphone in front of me. I don't think I need that. Do we want to start, Pascoe? Are you happy to jump in?
Yeah,
Okay, right. Well, it's been. It's okay. I can just project. It's fine. Okay, yeah. It's been a fascinating afternoon. So a great thank you to Pascoe and to Karen for organizing this. I found it incredibly interesting.
I've known Hazel for a very long time, but I heard things today I hadn't heard before. And the last session, well, really, I think that was the real sort of icing on the cake, isn't it? It's really fantastic to hear what our PhD students are doing and what a wide range of approaches they're taking. I think we're going to have a replication of that to wind up today with the final Q&A session. So it's real thrill for me to be able to sit here with my colleagues and to introduce them and then just to hear questions from all of you about the different approaches to empirical work. We have one question that's been submitted in advance, so I will get to that to start things off. But let me just introduce everyone. I'm sure you know everyone here, but I'm going to give you a short empirical biography for each person here, and I'm going to go in order. At the end from Allison, Dr. Allison Lindner is you conduct in theoretically grounded empirical studies of waste, the informal economy and sustainable development. And she's recently translated her PhD on sustainable development and the informal waste economy in South Africa into a documentary film. So I'm sure that's going to prompt a few questions. Her research is grounded in anthropology and law, and she also runs a network of early career researchers who focus on various aspects of waste law. And Allison was recently appointed to support the UN Rapporteur on the right to development. And so that's just a short highlight. I'm sure we'll hear more from Allison on this. And next is Dr. Pedro Schilling de Carvalho, and his research focuses on international financial regulation and sustainable finance. He has experience with empirical work both in academia and public policy, including research for the World Bank, the Green Climate Fund, the Gates Foundation, and the FCDO. Interestingly, you rely on both quantitative and qualitative methods, including network analysis, semi-structured elite interviews, and process tracing. And then next is Amber. It's lovely to see you again, Amber. We go back a long way from Amber's PhD here at UCL. Amber is currently a lecturer in competition law at the University of Manchester, and she is also a senior research fellow here in the Law Faculty's Centre for Law, Economics and Society. She's the author of Competition Law in South Asia, Policy, Diffusion and Transfer, in which she carried out extensive empirical analysis of the decisions of the Indian and Pakistani competition authorities over a 10-year period. So that would be very interesting to hear about long-term empirical research. And last but definitely not least is Dr. Karen Nokes. Karen's an interdisciplinary researcher whose work includes law, business and management, and psychology. Her research interests include access to justice, behavioral ethics, and psychological processes of judgment and decision-making within professional organizations. She currently has a research grant from the ESRC, researching the conduct of lawyers involved in the post office scandal and the sub-postmaster's experience of the criminal and civil justice process. So extremely timely research. I'm going to open it up to questions. I do have one that's been submitted in advance, but does anyone have a question that they would like to? Yes, is it?
So, noting something that Hazel said earlier about the pushback that she's about and the rest of that Sonam was mentioned about the difficulty of carving up kind of what goes on to meet ecological patterns. But one thing that's probably is whether doing doctrinal research is doing a kind of empirical research.
Who wants to have a go at that one? Allison, I kind of feel Allison might want to have a go at that one.
Yeah. So I think that
doctrinal legal research has a methodology and a method that is often unspoken, that can be empirical. So I think there is a kind of, don't want to say lack of recognition, but people who do doctrinal legal research don't often think as much as say empiricists or people who are doing like law and geography or law and finance or so about you know, the kind of architecture of the methodology of the use. And so I think it can be very empirical, but it's kind of implicit in what's being done in terms of research.
Yeah, I was going to kind of say that actually, I think there's a synergy in some ways with documentary analysis. I think there are some kind of crossovers that can happen there. And I think, like Allison said, I think maybe that some of that and not recognizing it is a true methodological sense is kind of unspoken. I guess where it then kind of departs is that in kind of social sciences and documentary analysis, we then have kind of quite distinctive analytical methods that we would then follow. I've never done doctrinal research, so I'm probably now going to butcher I can do it. But it doesn't seem to me to then have that systematic process that one would have to follow, that then you would say, I have done this sort of analysis over that one. So I think at the higher level, there's maybe a synergy with documentary analysis, but when you get more granular, I think then it gets more difficult. Yeah.
Pedro and Amber, anything you want to add to that?
Only thing I agree with Allison. I think it's sometimes potentially doctrinal sensibilities really help if you're working on a very multidisciplinary team, and especially if you're in a team with economists, folks that are more trained on the empirical research. I think often they potentially have issues with framing that someone that's more doctrinally minded might catch early on. And including that in the design of the empirical research, I think leads to better empirical research that also goes back to doctrinal, if that makes sense.
So I think I agree with Pedro really. I think the most, because I think doctrinal research can provide the framework and a very necessary framework for empirical research, but is doctrinal research, empirical research, are they equal? In that sense, I think it's a bit more difficult for me to grasp, because I see empirical research as, by for want of a better word, as an example of the sort of idea that you're researching. And I think doctrinal research is the idea, the framework, but not the example necessarily. And there may be situations where that's not true, but I can't think of any right now. A bit like Karen, because I can't think of those situations.
Well, can I just say it's a really interesting question, and because I perhaps it's one that we could explore more as a faculty, because I think there tends to be seen to be the divide, isn't there, between, well, I'm doing doctrinal, I'm not doing anything empirical, or I'm doing something empirical. And actually, I think we've heard with our 3 PhD students, there was a great overlap there between doctrinal and empirical, but I think the experience here is that there is an overlap, and it might be a nice way to draw in a bit more of our doctrinal colleagues into the discussion. I think there was a hand coming up. Yes.
It was a comment, I know, kind of in response to this. I wonder as well how much of this is to do with the fact that doctrinal methods don't do very well at describing what the method is. It kind of implies that we're kind of walking along and there's a case and this is a case, and it doesn't, for me, it didn't work in the context of my project, but it also means that when we're thinking about crossover, whereas empirical scholars do lots of work to say this is the method that I'm engaging with, this is the framework I'm looking at. It's not so much the case in a doctrinal paper. It's that a lot of it's assumed, in my experience.
Okay, well, good question. Thank you for that. Any other questions? So I've got a list here, so should I just have a go? Right. Okay. Well, one of them is very easy and descriptive, and then the other one's, I think, a little bit more thought-provoking. But for each of you, I'm really interested in what came first for you, law or your empirical work. So I put that in the context of, I think, Pascoe, you mentioned at the outset, almost 20 years ago, there was a study of empirical legal work here in the UK. And what it found is that most people doing empirical legal work started out not in law, but usually in social science or something else, and then moved to law. But I think things might be changing. So I'm interested to hear. Maybe we go in reverse order.
Okay.
We'll start with Karen.
Well, I think in terms of profession, law came first because I went into the law and practice for a short time. But certainly in terms of, I mean, I don't think I'd even heard of what empirical work was when I was kind of studying law, you know, back when dinosaurs roamed the earth. And certainly for me, empirical work came first with psychology, because that was where I first encountered and really got my love of research, and that was with largely doing experimental research, including kind of studying people kind of recalling word lists, whether they'd eaten Weetabix with extra sugar on top or not, to look at glucose consumption, the way that it affected recall, really exciting stuff like that. And then it was the psychology that really got me hooked. And then when I worked with the Sisters Regulation Authority, just became really interested in kind of psychology of lawyers and the behaviour, and how some lawyers managed to go through a career and not kind of cock up and get disciplined, and others did. And so that was kind of my interest that drew me in, but it was certainly a start in experimental methods in psychology, so very much from the social sciences point of view.
Yeah, so I think I can echo that a little bit, because I started off as a barrister and I came to academia a bit late. I finished my PhD in 2018. So I think my interest was in the law, but also about how, because I was a barrister, it was a lot about decisions and how they impact parties. So I was really interested in, you know, what is the effect law is having? You know, the law is there, it's fantastic, but is it translating into something else? And I think that's what drew me. And again, I mean, I wasn't thinking about doing empirical research. This is to answer a question you asked to the previous panel. I was just thinking, well, how can I substantiate what I'm saying? And it took me to empirical research, and I was really I mean, I felt most comfortable there because I was able to substantiate it with something real. I could put my hands on it, and yeah, I think that was a starting point, and I still really enjoy it. I feel that's the most sort of, that's when I feel like I'm really getting somewhere, is when I'm working with data, even if I'm creating it from scratch.
Ironically, I don't know if I know the answer, because coming to think of it, it was a bit of both. So during my first year of law school, it's 5 years in Brazil, which is where I'm from. I was also doing international relations. I was doing 2 courses. So I had stats, I had some training in empirical methods there that I carried over to. I didn't finish that degree, but I carried over to law. But you know, 5 years, you have time to do a bunch of different courses. So we had, as part of our core degree, sociology of the law, anthropology of the law. And we did have things that looked like cash. So I was involved in clinical work early on. So it was in a sense already sort of more practicing as as a legal practitioner, but especially considering that we were involved in running the center as well. We had to make already policy choices. We had to try to make a sense of what was happening there. So it's always been, I think, a bit involved worlds, if that makes sense.
So I guess I did my undergraduate degree in North America, where everyone who gets to law, by the time you get to law school, you already have 4 years of training in a different field. So it might be political science, or so I did half of my degree was in French and half was in anthropology. So I was already designing kind of empirical research at that stage. So I guess for me, the kind of empirical design came before the law. But that's not to say that I didn't envisage going on to study law. It was just a different starting point for me.
Well, I think that's interesting. So I think what we've got is your educational background. If you have something that isn't the sort of English UK based one, that can be a factor, but also practice and policy. And then the empirical work comes out of that. So that's quite interesting. Okay, my other question is, what's the one most important thing you need to do your empirical work? So that could be money, could be time, could be skills, it could be interactions, or cooperative work, support within, but all of the just amongst those things, what would you say is the one most important thing? And I'm going to start with Pedro this time.
I think for it's quite a unique area. Probably it's very opaque. Not a whole lot is public. So I'd say it's basically data and access, and those things, those sorts of hands in hand. So having the networks gets you to the data. So sort of the qualitative work gets you to the data that lets you do the quantitative work, which is not always often the case. And it creates sort of some cycles of the more you have that, the easier you have, in terms of finding the right research questions to get a sort of a pulse on how, what research questions matter. I do tend to work quite a bit with central banks, with securities regulators that are very guarded, generally speaking, even for researchers. And it gets, slightly easier each time.
Allison?
First thing that came to my mind is my tape recorder. If you're doing research, what you don't want to happen is that you've got the opportunity, assuming it's all, risk assessed and ethically approved and so on, that ethical research on this process, is to have a willing participant, but you don't have a way to record the interview. So for me, the tape recorder is really important. But also money and time is also vital. You can't do without this.
Well, you must have been pleased with the advent of iPhones then, because you've always got your tape recorder, no matter where you go. Yeah, great.
So agreeing with both of them, but trying to be different. And I think the first thing that came to my mind was the skill side of it. I think when you're working with data, rigor is so important. So it's quite regimented. And I think I find that's a great discipline as well, because it really keeps bringing you back to that very regimented nature of analysis. It's also tough because, I really remember feeling like I want to break free of this. Can I just be free, because I'm in this frame constantly. But I think that really, it then goes to the rigor of the final, project or report or thesis or publication or whatever you're working on. But yeah, rigor and that ability to stay within that framework for long periods of time.
Yeah. I think for me, because I was thinking first of all about time cost, and actually for me it's about, and this is an overused word, but I'm going to use it, which is resilience.
Yeah.
Because if you want to kind of know what you're doing every day and you want to be certain of outcomes, don't do any empirical work, because there's no such thing as a perfect project. Every project is filled with huge amounts of anxiety. And that's why, in terms of have I finished the research question in the right way, anxiety about tweaking the method, anxiety about access, and it also about you need to be kind of resilient in respect of the data collection part of it. I've been doing I'm usually a kind of a quantitative researcher, but I've been doing some qualitative work and interviewing some postmasters, and the pressure on going into someone's personal space and interviewing them about a very traumatic event. I actually, every interview that I do, I feel nervous. It's almost like you're going on stage, and having to connect with that, and almost thinking that you're doing it almost like for the first time, because you are with that participant that you have. So I think it's resilience and getting used to discomfort, which I think would be the thing that I think you need to engage with. But there is, on the flip side of it, nothing like it as well. Because to be in front of a participant who shares their innermost thoughts and beliefs is a very blessed and treasured place to be. So it actually is it's all worth that anxiety.
It is amazing how many people let you in to so many aspects of their legal journey and otherwise. So, but I'm just going to pick up on, so please, any questions, please raise your hand. Otherwise, I'm just going to continue with all of my questions for my colleagues. But I think, have you had experiences, this picks up on your point about anxiety or the stress of doing empirical work? You know, have you had experiences where your work has been controversial? Because quite often empirical work is very policy oriented, and you're having to present that to policymakers who, you know, you may be giving them a message they may not wish to hear. I'm just giving some possible ideas of how, but have you found that some of your empirical work has been challenging in that way? And I guess maybe on a more positive note, who do you rely upon to help you with that? But you can start with the tough policy ones. Pedro? Or no, okay, Allison. I'll start with Allison at the end.
Sure. Yeah. I haven't really, I mean, I don't think my research is particularly controversial because it's looking at the informal waste economy and how they can realize constitutional rights, i.e. the constitutional rights of sustainable development within South Africa. And part of that is sort of the formalization of informal waste workers. So I actually find my research quite supportive of the work of policymakers. So I haven't really had, in my interactions with policymakers, much pushback. What I might encounter for policymakers is like most policymakers, they don't have the time to necessarily engage with very nuanced discussion around the way that they could do things that they don't have lots of time to do, but it's really essential for them to do their job. So that,
Pedro?
I completely share what I think Amber and Karen said in terms of I think internally there's that anxiety that you don't know if your hours of research are going to pan out until basically you're there, which doesn't quite happen if you're not doing other kinds of research. That is, you do need, I think, a ton of resilience to get through that. To be honest, in interactions with policymakers, I had sort of the opposite impression, probably because we're lawyers. So I think often if we don't use the language of empirical work, when we're talking with policymakers, with economists, we're going to be dismissed as folks that don't understand the language they're saying. So that gets us a bit more at the table. And I'd say that potentially I sometimes had more pushback from legal scholars rather than from the policymakers.
Sure. Yes, that completely understand that.
I have a story. I'll keep it short. So I published my research as a book. So the core was the India-Pakistan analysis, which I'd done as part of my PhD as well, but I looked at 6 other countries and it was a theoretical framework, etc. Very excited. I wanted to have a book launch in Pakistan. So one of my findings was that, to use diffusion theory, one of my findings was that Pakistan had not considered its competition law, and therefore it has not been able to implement it as successfully as India, which had spent a lot of time considering it. But I've been very, and rightfully, complimentary of the Competition Commission of Pakistan because I thought they had done good work, but whatever. I present the book launch, the chairperson of the Competition Commission of Pakistan is the discussant. She was also the person I'd interviewed extensively. She was also the person who had provided me with the data for my research. And she absolutely disagreed with me. It was the most shocking experience. I sat there, it was just the 2 of us. And she said, I don't agree with anything that's been said here. And I thought that was extremely, I mean, for me, a very difficult place to be in. But luckily she asked me, so where did you get your data from? And I was able to say, from you. That's a very good touche. I mean, that's really the only good moment in that. But I think I think what I took away from that is that, yes, I was doing empirical research and the data was speaking for itself, but it's embedded in a political economic context. And that context was informing the way my study was received. And I mean, I took it very positively, I have to say. It's a funny story, but I really learned a lot from it. And I said, you know, you can't let, you know, yes, numbers speak for themselves, but it's so important to embed them in that bigger narrative and to, you know, to much as I think policymakers resist hearing it because they don't have time, but it's so important to actually begin with that and end with that and not let the numbers do a lot of the talking, which is, you know, because I was so excited about the empirical side of the work I'd done, I was letting the numbers do a lot more of the talking, but anyway, lesson learned.
Okay.
So,
I've got a very recent example actually, because last week we kind of, as part of the ESRC project, we launched our latest working paper 7, which looked at the barrister called Richard Morgan, King's Counsel, gave evidence to the Post Office Horizon IT inquiry last November about his role as the lead counsel for the Post Office in the case against Lee Castleton. And if you'd like to go and read the comments on the Law Society Gazette on the piece, you basically think I was like spawn of the devil. You know, they're very, very, very critical. And I actually, do you know what, I suppose I'm kind of used to there being no love in the room. When you work for the SRA for 20 years, there's never any love in the room when you go out, right? To practitioners. But actually, if the role of what we do in looking at lawyers' ethics and the conduct of lawyers is to hold a mirror up, and if only some of those lawyers then think twice about what they do, and I think we've kind of done our job, and I kind of accept that controversy and the critique back as being part of the job. And I think if we don't get it, I'm probably not doing something right.
That's often been said about empirical work. If you're not upsetting someone, you're probably not doing it right. Or we ought to be a bit questionable about it. Or eventually, I think, empirical work, because I think what we have here is 2 examples really of, you know, you've been confronted by people challenging it, but then in other circumstances, the policymakers are extremely welcoming of empirical work and grateful to have that grounding that often they don't get. So I've been given the 2-minute warning already by Pascoe. I thought you were going to 2 minutes. Yes, I do. Exactly. Well, okay. Well, I'll let you have the last word then. Of course.
Well, it's just sort of personal interest thing, really. It's one of those things that goes around in my head is in terms of just the approach to work. I was going to say, I'm loving this discussion about is doctrinal law research, empirical, and you know, that sort of thing is my nice bit like achievements of AI. Sort of, it happens, you don't even quite how it happens. It's just this question of doing it. So the question is, to what extent do you tend to do you formulate questions when you go looking for the data that how you construct the data, answer questions, or is it a case of what's the data, what's the possibilities here, and what are the questions that I can ask you? With the data, they're very sort of different processes, and they're thinking to the same place, but I'm sort of intrigued in how they vary between the different fields and different approaches. We've got diversity and
Pedro, I know you do deal with a lot of data. So.
I think it varied quite a bit. I'm trying to think of the most recent examples. I think quite often there's something, I won't even call it a data point. There's something new in the world of international financial regulation that then prompts a, well, where can I look to see if that's something worth looking at? And it's back and forth exactly because of how opaque that process is. So I did quite a bit of work on diffusion. So to try to understand sort of influence who are the countries that are sort of setting international standards for finance. It's all informal, it's all non-public international law, it's all regulatory networks. You only get the outcome, but you often can try to get a sense of where a certain approach to regulation came from. So oftentimes you're reading the newspapers or something like that, and you see something new, and you might start seeing that something new popping up at different places. That usually prompts me to, well, let's see if there's something emerging here that might be worthwhile, transforming into an actual research question.
I really echo that. I think there's an observed phenomena. You see something, which is also a form of data, I suppose, but then you go looking for it specifically, but also because I work on diffusion and transfer, and I'm very curious about patterns. Can I observe a pattern? So I think maybe it's not a singular phenomena. It's more sort of they're popping up in different places, and there is a pattern, and that takes me back to the data, and then I do a more sort of a question-based research. So a bit of both.
Allison?
Really good question. I think it is kind of iterative process. So for me, I'm interested in how the kind of social impetus behind, I guess, how the informal economy works, in terms of informal waste economy. So I kind of, at the beginning, I'm interested in kind of the economic questions and social legal questions. And of course, there's that kind of observable phenomenon that I'm interrogating. But then I also use the literature to kind of make sense of the observable phenomenon. And so when I ask questions, they're often influenced by the literature and influenced by what the observable data is telling me from the outset. And throughout the analysis, I kind of go back and forth to see what does the data say, what does the literature say, and how can I maybe even create a different kind of, create a kind of theory around what the data is saying. So a bit of grounded theory, but not entirely. So I think for me it's back and forth.
And I think that for me, I think using the post office as an example, it's that kind of that's the phenomena that kind of drives a set of questions that we want to ask about. How could this have taken place? How could the lawyers have done these things, which kind of looking at hindsight, you think, my goodness, why were they not doing X, Y, and Z? And then for me, it's kind of thinking, well, actually, what data do we have? So, I think, and part of being a researcher is about being efficient. So actually, what data is there around that we can use? How valid is that data? How reliable is that data? Whether we should use it in the first place? And obviously, we're using in our case study methodology some of the evidence that's coming out of the inquiry, very rich kind of data that we can work on. But then, especially in respect of, if you look at decision-making research, we can look back and people can kind of say, we can hypothesize why people made decisions from transcripts of evidence, but actually there's nothing like doing kind of experimental and quasi-experimental work to really get to the nub of it. So for that kind of work, you need to go out and get data, because actually the data that you've got already is beset with a whole host of limitations, social response bias and all that kind of thing, that actually only takes you so far. So the data that you've got can be brilliant, but it's recognizing the limitations of it, really.
Well, it sounds like a classic chicken and egg,
yeah,
isn't it, really? I think I do need to wind things up now. I really just want to say thank you all for taking the time to share your experiences with empirical research with all of us. And I think it really sort of brings us back to something Hazel said at the beginning, which it motivates her, which is, I think all four of you have said at some point that, you're interested in how things work. And that probably is something that underpins, all of empirical researchers. It's a question that we're constantly seeking to answer. So I guess at that point, do I hand over to you, Pascoe?
Just very briefly, just to say thank you for everyone who came. Thank you for everyone who's
still here. And you are rewarded by the bar is open.
My drink.
Outside, where it's still available.
Well, can I just say on behalf of everyone here, thank you to you, Pascoe, and to Karen for organizing this. It's been a really, really interesting afternoon. So thank you.
Thank you.
Well,
Thank you.